Stoughton Media Access Corporation is pleased to present International Forum, a new cable show of interest, periodically interviewing foreign newsmakers, bringing them from across the ocean directly to your living room. Here's your host for this week's show, Wayne Pomiansky.
Hello and welcome to International Forum. My name is Wayne Pomiansky and I'll be hosting today's program. We are delighted to be having this return visit. We are connected to Jerusalem in Israel. Our guest is someone who's been on the program several times before, extremely knowledgeable of goings-on in the Middle East and also here in the U.S. Of course, I'm speaking of Yoram Ettinger, former Israeli Minister for Congressional Affairs at Israel's embassy in Washington, D.C., where he served with the rank of ambassador. Ambassador Ettinger has served as Israel's Consul General in Houston and as Director of Israel's Government Press Office prior to retirement. Currently, he consults to members of Israel's cabinet and Knesset and regularly briefs U.S. legislators and their staffs on Israel's contribution to vital U.S. interests, on the root causes of international terrorism, and on other issues of bilateral concern. Ambassador Ettinger travels frequently to the U.S., and much of his higher education occurred here in the United States. He got an undergraduate degree at the University of Texas, El Paso, and I know he is concerned about the news we're receiving about tornadoes in Texas, where he had previously resided. And then he went on to UCLA for his graduate education. Ambassador Ettinger is the editor of several different publications, one of which is titled Straight from the Jerusalem Cloakroom and Boardroom. These are newsletters on issues of national security and overseas investments in Israel's high-tech industry. He also publishes the Ettinger Report. His expertise is very vast, spanning U.S.-Israel relations, Middle East politics, demography and population fluxes and fallacies in the Middle East, as well as overseas investments in Israel's high-tech arena. Quite a background indeed. So again, I would like to welcome Ambassador Ettinger back to International Forum. Good to see you again, Mr. Ambassador.
Thank you very much.
Quite welcome. We, of course, on numerous programs, we've talked about the issue of terrorism in the Mideast. This, I think, is the first time in one of our broadcasts where we actually discuss terrorism, domestic terrorism that's occurred here in the United States. As you know, Ambassador Ettinger, we tape our program in Stoughton, Massachusetts, which is several miles outside of Boston. Just about a month ago, April 15th, a holiday in Massachusetts called Patriots' Day. We have a sporting event that attracts entrants from all over the world. It is, of course, the marathon in Massachusetts. And toward the fourth hour of the marathon, we were shocked when two bombs went off, causing the death of 3 observers of the race, as well as numerous very, very severe injuries. We still have some of the injured in hospitals and rehabilitation centers, and it certainly has brought home the issue of terrorism again to our shores. And I wonder, as you sit in Jerusalem, whether news of the terrorist bombings here in the United States was received in Israel, and what the reaction was.
Well, absolutely. This still is being followed by vast majority of Israelis. We are experienced, unfortunately, in such incidents. And it seems to me that it was a tragic wake-up call, a tragic reminder to the fact that Islamic terrorism has become a very distinct mutual threat to both the free world and Israel, to both the USA and Israel. It's a tragic reminder to the fact that there are scores, probably hundreds, of similar sleeper cells throughout the US, many of them supported by Muslim rogue regimes, Iran and other regimes, awaiting the command from the headquarters in the Middle East. And certainly it has been a tragic reminder to the necessity of further and further cooperation between the US and Israel in the battle against Islamic terrorism. And last and not least, it was probably reaffirmation of the fact that there is indeed such thing as Islamic terrorism, jihadist terrorism, unlike some key persons in the current administration in Washington who have refused to acknowledge the reality of Islamic terrorism, referring to it as anything but Islamic terrorism, workplace violence, extremist actions, and certainly if you are ambiguous ideologically, you cannot be very clear operationally. And hopefully the events in Boston will spare the US much worse type of terrorist action, which undoubtedly are planned by Muslim terrorist groups in the Middle East and beyond.
We also had this week a sort of an ominous report. We're just starting to get information about it. Again, this happened here in Massachusetts. A lot of the water, the drinking water that goes to the city of Boston and communities around Boston comes from the Quabbin Reservoir, which is a beautiful reservoir in the western part of the state. And as I understand it from the news reports, a couple of nights ago, 6 or 7 young people were detected late at night around the reservoir. They were confronted by authorities, and I think what's raised a little bit of concern certainly is apparently they described themselves as chemical engineers from Saudi Arabia, other Mideast countries, and they mentioned to authorities that they, as engineers, had an interest in the reservoir, but we certainly are concerned when we hear that unauthorized people with Mideast roots would be tramping around the water supply reservoir for the city of Boston. And I wonder, I'm sure we'll have more details about just exactly what they were doing and why they were there, especially close to midnight. And I wonder whether in Israel you have surveillance of some of the infrastructure that could potentially be at risk. Have you heard about this particular episode here in Massachusetts?
No, I haven't heard about this particular incident, but I'm not surprised at all because the key tactic exercised by terrorist regimes in their battle against the free world, against the USA, excuse me, the key tactic has been the intimidation of civilians. And their attempt is to erode the confidence felt by American civilians in the capability of their government to stand up to terrorists and therefore squeeze concessions from the American government. Water resources has been one of the targets of terrorists. In Israel, we have managed to develop many tactics as well as technologies to secure the safety of our water resources. Homeland security in Israel does include the protection, the safeguarding of our water supplies. We have scientists who are dedicated only to such an assignment, and that is another element of already active cooperation between the U.S. and Israel, whereby Israel, which is experienced in facing terrorism, is sharing its lessons in safeguarding water resources with the American authorities. By the way, the same way that the U.S. authorities benefited from Israeli training in responding very, very swiftly to the recent terrorism in Boston. Some of the doctors, some of the first responders in the Boston area were trained by Israelis. Unfortunately, we are very experienced in first responding to acts of terrorism and in safeguarding water supplies. In fact, also the detection of the two brothers was assisted by certain Israeli technologies of condensing a large number of photographs, of quick, swift deciphering of photographs. And in many respects, Israel has been battle-tested, counter-terrorism tested lab at the disposal of the U.S. until recently only on the real battlefield and only when it comes to defense industries, but recently also when it comes to homeland security. When it comes to water, it's not only safety of water, it's also tactics developed by Israel to save water. There is usually 20%, sometimes more than 20% loss of water due to leakage and other problems. Israel has excelled in minimizing all the way to 5% and less. We are sharing it with the U.S. and other countries. Israel is recycling sewage for agricultural purposes and most recently also increasingly for human consumption. And we have managed to recycle sewage in a way which is standing up to the toughest nutritional standards. 80% of our sewage is recycled. 75% of our agricultural requirements is a derivative of recycled sewage. And we are by far the number one country, as far as I know. U.S. only recycles 1% of its sewage, while you don't feel the need probably in the Massachusetts area. Folks in the Southwest, in the West, who are afflicted by years of drought, do need more water supplies, and certainly such Israeli technologies would be pretty beneficial for them as far as alleviating the pressure of drought.
Well, water certainly is becoming something that more and more states here in the United States are concerned about. We have the good fortune, I think, here in Massachusetts to have water resources that heretofore have been pretty plentiful, although some of our communities do at this time of year when the weather heats up impose restrictions on outside use of water. But you're quite right. In parts of the United States, especially the Southwest, in parts of the Midwest, drought is a major problem. And I'm sure that any technologies that Israel is able to help us with would certainly be greatly appreciated. Let's shift our conversation a little bit to politics. It's been a couple of months now since the elections in Israel. Of course, we know that Prime Minister Netanyahu has won a third term as Prime Minister, albeit with somewhat less representation of his party, the Likud party, in Parliament. Now that things have settled down, the elections are over, what would you say would be Mr. Netanyahu's primary goals in terms of his agenda going forward?
Well, there's no doubt that by far the number one goal or challenge threat is the possibility that Iran would gain access to nuclear capability. This has been for a number of years Israel's number one challenge, and it will remain as such until we make sure that no such plague becomes part of Middle East reality. Next to that, there is the ongoing threat of terrorism, which, by the way, has been intensified recently. The interesting phenomena is that every time we have a very well appreciated visit by distinguished Americans, it comes along with intensification of Palestinian terrorism. And indeed, in the aftermath of the visit by President Obama and Secretary of State John Kerry, and another visit, possible visit by John Kerry, we have seen a rise of Palestinian terrorism in the area. We are certainly focused on the threat of the Syrian volcano, the lava coming out of Syria will sweep some neighboring areas, and we're trying to make sure that it does not sweep us here in Israel. However, while we are always tuned to national security challenges, for the first time, I think that the vast majority of Israelis are also preoccupied simultaneously with the security issue to economics. It's probably the age or the era of it's the economy stupid here in Israel. Israelis are preoccupied with the cost of living. Israelis are occupied with the cost of housing. Israelis are occupied with the level of taxation. And we have a very interesting reality here in Israel. At the same time, when the macro indicators of the Israeli economy are certainly among the top in the world as far as the major economic indicators, as far as inflation, unemployment, public debt ratio to gross domestic product, exports, foreign exchange reserves, etc. At the same time, the micro indicators are pretty worrisome, and the focus of the newly established government as a government has been to reassess the regulatory labyrinth in Israel, to limit monopolies and increase competition, to open the different markets to more and more competition, to simplify the bureaucratic process on the way of construction, etc. All that in order to make sure that the very, very solid macro economic data trickle down also to the individual, and there is a lot to be desired in that respect.
I will definitely want to talk to you some more about the Israeli economy as our conversation continues. But first, I wanted to follow up. You mentioned high-level visits to Israel and possibility of the new Secretary of State returning to Israel in the not too distant future. We'll talk about that in a little bit. But first, I wanted to follow up on President Obama's visit to Israel back in March. I'm sure you follow the news here in the U.S., and the president right now is mired in several issues. I think he's going to do a news conference today. He's received the resignation of the Commissioner of the Internal Revenue Service over a big flap involving the IRS, seemingly focusing on requests for no tax status on the part of certain groups identified with the right. He has that issue, the loss of 4 lives at the consulate in Benghazi back on September 11th of last year. It certainly seems like that issue continues to churn. Some would say it's staying on the front burner, so to speak, because the Republicans are trying to keep it there and maybe soil the image of the former Secretary of State. And then he's also, President Obama, dealing with an issue involving the requirement that the Associated Press turn over some telephone records in connection with what's alleged to be a leak of critical information. So the president has his hands full at the moment here in the U.S. He did have what seemed to be a very successful visit with Prime Minister Netanyahu back in March. We've all seen the pictures of the president and Mr. Netanyahu smiling and shaking hands. It seemed like a very much improved and cordial relationship between the two gentlemen. What was the reaction in Israel to the Obama visit in March?
Well, one needs to realize that for many, maybe even most Israelis, the U.S. is like an extended home scene for us. When President Obama was in the country, television, radio, print media were all preoccupied with the visit as if there was no other issue on the agenda. And it's not only politics. You would be surprised how many Israelis follow the NBA playoff. Many of us followed the failure of the Celtics this year. Only yesterday or 2 days ago, we heard that the Knicks were defeated by the Pacers. We do follow the surprising Memphis victory over the Oklahoma City team, and certainly Miami victory over Chicago, and San Antonio very, very difficult struggle against the Golden State Warriors. So there's nothing new in Israelis following U.S. Happy events and sad events. When Obama was here, he was received as if he was an Israeli VIP himself. There's no doubt that the atmosphere was much better than expected, much better than Obama's previous visit to the Middle East 2009, where he skipped over Israel. And the chemistry between him and the prime minister seems to be much better than it used to be. However, and the however is very fundamental, I don't assess that the visit transformed the state of mind of either President Obama or Prime Minister Netanyahu. We saw that also in the president's last event in Jerusalem, where he addressed a group of students and basically went back to square one. And square one for me is moral equivalence between the Palestinians and the Israelis. The Israelis have to contribute, the Palestinians have to contribute. both suffer, both want to have peace. And I think that that type of moral equivalence is very immoral. It's immoral and it's strategically flawed because no one should exercise moral equivalence when it comes to the Palestinians who systematically have sided with enemies and rivals of the U.S., beginning with the Nazis, going through the communist regime of the USSR and East Europe, then Khomeini and Saddam Hussein and bin Laden. Palestinians always sided with them, as they do today, with Russia and China and North Korea, not with the U.S. And then you have Israel, which is 100% so-called in the pocket of the U.S., and we feel very good in this warm pocket. But there's no moral way to exercise moral equivalence between those two elements, and that was a pretty disappointing note to end the visit of President Obama. We wait to see the coming visit by Secretary John Kerry. What message will he bring? And again, my expectation is not that John Kerry suddenly will transform his worldview, which is more or less consistent with the president, and therefore I do not expect miracles, which means we should not hold our breath for a breakthrough between the Israelis and Arabs in general, Israelis and Arab Palestinians in particular. And one of the signals for realism was Secretary Kerry's recent next to almost endorsement of the Arab League proposal to produce peace between Israel and the Arabs. It's a peace proposal which is based on the claim by the Palestinians to return to the pre-67 areas of Israel, which they claim happens to be their home. This is not the West Bank. This is not Judea, Samaria. This is Tel Aviv, Haifa, Jerusalem, Galilee, and the Negev. It's a proposal which is based on 67 lines with minor land swap, which basically means a suicidal proposal, a suicidal map. And it was unfortunate that Secretary of State John Kerry took it seriously and referred to it as a very encouraging step towards an agreement. While I hope that he will become more realistic before he returns to our region, I'm realistic enough to assume that John Kerry is not at the stage where he allows such things to change his worldview. He's going to uphold his worldview, a worldview which considers the UN to be a chief player in international relations, a worldview which believes in multilateral rather than unilateral type of actions, namely subordinate U.S. Israeli foreign policy to the UN, to NATO, to any other global coalition. And most worrisomely is it's a worldview which does not believe in confronting the rogue regimes, but rather dialoguing with them. And we have seen it in action, this worldview, when it comes to the Arab Street. Then Senator Kerry, now Secretary of State John Kerry, he really believes that this is a prelude to potential democracy. He really believes that this is the post-authoritarian type of Middle East, but the reality, unfortunately, is tragically very different. The Arab Street is now much more anti-American compared to 3 years ago. It's much more violent than it was 3 years ago. It's much more intolerant than it was 3 years ago, and it's much more anti-peace and anti-Western values than it was 3 years ago. Sadly enough, this is not the view upheld by Secretary Kerry. But to conclude my assessment with a note of hope, sometimes a critical mass of evidence does coerce people to transform their worldview. Hopefully, the Iranian reality, the Syrian reality, the implications of the Boston terrorism reality, the potential volcano inside Jordan, which could transform Jordan into an anti-American country. All that hopefully will cause some change in the worldview of both the president as well as the Secretary of State.
You, interestingly, you mentioned Secretary of State Kerry's comment that the proposal by the Arab League was, I guess he characterized it as an encouraging, an encouraging step. And here in the U.S., we have this comment that flattery will get you everywhere, and I wonder if Kerry's remarks, might be treated as diplomat speak. In a manner of speaking, to, throw out a little bit of encouragement or positive reinforcement. Certainly Kerry is, he's no fool. He's the former head or chief of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. He's traveled widely. I believe he certainly understands the Middle East. Yet it seems, he has mentioned in terms of his own agenda that trying to make progress in bringing peace to the Middle East is right at the top of his agenda. And might he have made that comment in the hope of saying, in effect, hey guys, let's see if we can leverage what you've proposed to something that would really be worthwhile progress in the Middle East. I know you've characterized in one of your posts the Arab League proposal as akin to trying to sell waterfront property in Arizona, which I just wonder if you see any glimmer of hope from the comments of the Secretary and in this position the Arab League has taken.
Well, I borrowed that term from country western singer Randy Travis, who has a country western hit. I got some oceanfront property in Arizona, and if you'll buy that, I'll throw in the Golden Gate for free. And I think that Randy Travis, in that respect, has demonstrated more realism than many Western policymakers, because it's not a question of flattery or no flattery. There is a reality when a U.S. policymaker takes a position. He must realize that that is going to be now the base for the Arabs. Namely, Arabs must be more adamant and more radical than the American position. So for the Secretary of State to opine on the Arab League proposition has made that proposition already too moderate for the Arabs. We saw that with President Obama and Vice President Joe Biden, Secretary of State Hillary, when they insisted, in my mind, for all the wrong reasons, that Israel should desist for 8 months from construction in Judea and Samaria. They view it as a gesture. Some reckless Israeli policymakers also viewed it as a gesture. The Arabs viewed it as the American position, which they must now outflank from the more radical side. And therefore, because of that American demand. We haven't had any negotiation until this very day, and the Palestinians now ask for any negotiation to begin with an Israeli commitment to desist from any construction whatsoever infinitely. And when it comes, therefore, to being in touch with the Middle East, I don't want to put down John Kerry. He's a favorite son of Massachusetts. I'm aware of that. But with all due respect, being the chairman of Senate Foreign Relations doesn't make you automatically a successful policymaker. There's a difference between being a senator and being an executive, as Americans know from American politics. And Senator John Kerry, for instance, was until the eruption of the civil war in Syria a member of a very tiny club in Washington, which, by the way, included also Secretary of Defense Chuck Hagel. Both were members of the Philo Assad Club. They always referred to Papa Assad and then to the current son Assad as potentially constructive leaders. They insisted that the Assads were ready to conclude peace with Israel. All required was a vast and major Israeli painful concession. And we know very well of the character of the Assad family from the current war in Syria. And one can imagine the implications for Israel if we would have followed the pressure or the proposal by then Senator Kerry to give away the Golan Heights in return for an agreement with what he considered to be a constructive regime in Damascus. So I'm not closing the door on potential success by Secretary Kerry, but I'm trying to point out that the track record is not very encouraging, and the track record has suggested that those who consider concessions to Arabs in the Middle East as a facilitator of an agreement should examine prior concessions and realize, for instance, that the Oslo Accord, whereby Israel imported some 60,000 Palestinian terrorists from Iraq and Yemen and Sudan and Libya and Syria and Lebanon and Jordan and Tunisia, and we import them literally to the doorstep of the intended Jewish victims. We gave them the whole of Gaza. We gave them 40% of Judea and Samaria. We provided them with arms, with ammunition, and what did it produce? More hate education, more terrorism, and more uncompliance, by the way, as should have been expected by anybody who can read the writing on the Middle Eastern Wall.
Speaking of the writing on the Middle Eastern Wall, you mentioned Syria, and of course, here in the United States, we're very much focused on the events in Syria. I think, we keep expecting that the Assad regime will fall, but it hasn't so far. We certainly followed recent news events pertaining to reported Israeli missions to neutralize missiles that were reported to be en route from Iran through Syria to Lebanon. And at least two sorties or two missions to destroy those missiles launched by Israel. Do you anticipate that Israel is being drawn in and becoming more of an active participant in supporting the opposition to Assad? What do you see going forward as Israel's possible involvement in the tragic events in
Well,
Syria?
Israel made it very clear that we have limited and we shall limit our involvement only to denial of non-conventional or game-changing capabilities, denying those capabilities from Hezbollah, which is an extension of the Iranian arm in the western side of the Middle East. Strengthening of Hezbollah means strengthening of Iran, means undermining stability in Lebanon, and could mean a potential blow to Western interest and enhancement of Iranian and indirectly Russian and Chinese interests in the Middle East. It's not an American interest. It's not an Israeli interest. We absolutely have not interfered in the war on the side of the terrorists who are fighting the terrorist regime of Assad. We're talking about a war among terror organizations, the pro-Assad terrorists and the anti-Assad terrorists. It's very nice to look at it as a war between those who vie for personal dignity and human rights and democracy on one hand, and those who are authoritarian, Assad-like dictatorship folks. But the reality is unfortunately much more gloomy. This is a reflection of what the Middle East is all about. And by the way, it comes back to the John Kerry's initiative to promote peace, because when you look at Syria, as has been the case in every single Arab country, Libya, Tunisia, Egypt, Yemen, Bahrain, and pretty soon in Jordan and other countries, we get a notion of what does it mean to have regime change. Regime change does come through violence. And what does it mean to maintain domestic agreements? It means absolutely nothing. Intra-Arab regimes, intra-Muslim regimes have never been signed or carved in stone, always signed in ice. And that also tells us what can one expect of an agreement signed between a so-called infidel state, such as Israel, which is considered by Muslims as an infidel Jewish state. How would they treat an agreement with that infidel state? Would they be more compliant than they are towards one another? There's no logic behind such a simplistic, gullible assumption. And therefore, anybody who suggests that Israel should go into a land for peace has absolutely no clue of what Middle East attitude towards agreements are. This should be peace for peace agreement and not land for peace, especially, again, when we realized only recently we uprooted Jews from Gaza. We gave the whole Gaza to the Palestinians, and what has followed was unprecedented terrorism, unprecedented bombing of Israel, because in the Middle East, when you throw a piece of your flesh to the sharks, they don't become vegetarians. They pursue you with much more determination than ever before, or as suggested by a very well-known Turkish leader in the Middle East, you're either enjoying the menu or you become part of the menu. To coerce Israel into painful concessions for an agreement which by definition is signed into ice rather than stone is basically an invitation for Israel to become part of the Middle Eastern menu.
Ambassador Ettinger, how have the Israeli public, responded to the Israeli missions against the missiles traveling through Syria? You know, here in the U.S., we have a pretty spirited dialogue about whether the United States should become more involved, principally in supporting the resistance to the Assad regime in Syria. I would say there's probably a higher percentage of Americans who feel that the U.S. Has its hands full in Afghanistan and Iraq, and as well maybe even in its relationships with Pakistan, and that we should stay out of Syria. What has been the response of the Israeli public to the missile destroying missions by Israel?
Well, for most Israelis, the vast majority, it has been an uplifting experience. Once again, proving to ourselves that we do have the means, the capability, and mostly the will to exercise power here in an area where you must flex a muscle if you want to stay alive. This again reflects an Israeli policy, which is not an anti-Assad policy, definitely not anti-opposition to Assad. It is a policy which says we don't want any game-changing elements introduced into Syria or into Lebanon, definitely not to the hands of Hezbollah, again, the extension of Iran in our area. My hope is that the Obama regime will learn from the mistakes committed in Libya. The Obama regime took a lead role in toppling Gaddafi, only to get on hand much more volatile reality in Libya, much more bloodshed in Libya, and much more anti-Americanism in Libya. It's very tragic to watch bloodshed in Syria, but interference in that bloodshed could lead to much more bloodshed, because if you interfere in Syria the way you did in Libya, with or without NATO, this could produce an Al-Qaeda or an Al-Qaeda related or a Muslim Brotherhood regime in Syria, which in turn could lead to much more bloodshed inside Syria, but also throughout the Middle East. And sadly, tragically enough, we have to choose not between the good and the bad, but between the lesser of the evil. And I think the lesser of the evil is to stay on the sideline at this stage rather than interfere and cause, in my mind, much worse reality than the bad one which we experience right now.
Yoram, let's switch our conversation again to the economy. The world, of course, experienced a major economic meltdown in 2008, 2009, although the state of Israel seemed to sail right through that period with pretty good economic results. My understanding today is that gross domestic product in Israel exceeds that of most of the Western nations, and unemployment in Israel is about 6.5%, compared to the U.S. over 7%. How's the Israeli economy doing, and what are your thoughts about how Israel's economy contributes to the U.S. economic growth and global economic growth?
Well, we certainly have our share of problems. We are now confronting a growing budget deficit. But what is a growing budget deficit for us is a dream goal for the vast majority of Western economies. We are now facing roughly 5% budget deficit. And that budget deficit is threatening the entire Israeli economy. I assume that the American Fed folks would embrace it right away if they could get a 5% budget deficit. We are concerned now about taxes because we have to raise taxes by 1 or 1.5% after 20 years of systematic decrease of taxes. And there are concerns that unemployment may even reach 7%, which again is a dream goal for American economies. Cost of living is pretty high in Israel, and it's not that easy in Israel to get housing, etc. However, the macro economic indicators are definitely some of the best in the world. Just heard today that France is experiencing a negative growth of 0.1%. Germany is experiencing the last quarter, the first quarter of 2013, 0.1% economic growth. In Israel, our current estimate are around 3.5% annual growth, and it worries Israelis because we were used to significantly higher annual growth of the economy. Inflation is also pretty low in Israel. There are many complaints in Israel, and rightly so, about rising price of produce, rising price of apartments, etc. But we're talking about an inflation which would be around 1.5–2% annually. Again, it's a major goal by most economies. Our economy probably will do much better in the next few years because as of March, we started producing for the first time natural gas from our offshore drilling, which, by the way, have been led by a Houston-based company, Noble Energy. We're talking about Israel, which will become, by the year 2017, maybe even sooner than that, a net exporter of natural gas. There is now a public debate in the country. Should we allow exportation or should we keep it for domestic consumption? But we have the Noble Energy from Texas. We have Italians, Australians. We have Norwegians who are drilling in Israel for natural gas. The Russians want to get in. So far, we have not allowed them in. The Chinese want to buy our natural gas. All that looks pretty good for the Israeli economy, which never benefited from significantly from natural resources. But the main natural resource of the Israeli economy has been brain power, the human factor, which has not only benefited Israel, but to a large extent, it has been a pipeline which has transmitted for the last 20–25 years, but more so in the last few years, technological innovations, cutting-edge technologies from Israel to the U.S. industry. The top 200, 300, 400 American high-tech companies do have presence in Israel. They establish research and development centers in Israel. They are aware, they are cognizant of the capabilities of the Israeli brain, and many of them, like Intel and Microsoft and Motorola and IBM and Hewlett-Packard and Google and eBay and Facebook, etc., Cisco, they all produce much of their innovative elements here in Israel, and that has been quite a benefit, a unique benefit to the American industry, to the American employment, American exports, American research and development, complement of Israel. At the same time, Israel has benefited because we benefit from the American market, we benefit from American investments. It has been a win-win type of mutually beneficial cooperation, which I believe is unique in the world. It has benefited America commercially. It has benefited America defense-wise, homeland security-wise, military-wise. I'm not aware of any cooperation by the U.S. with any country in the world which has yielded so much for the U.S. as has been the cooperation with the Jewish state, with Israel.
Yoram, somewhat related, you had a very interesting blog recently, title of which was Israel at 65. We have about maybe three and a half minutes left in our program today, and I thought maybe a nice way to wrap things up in the 3 minutes we have remaining would be for you perhaps to share with our viewers some of your reflections about Israel at 65.
Well, if you look back 65 years ago, 600,000 Jews, no military, no economy, hardly any significant support anywhere in the world. Countries who voted for the establishment of Israel did that with the idea that it's going to be a tenuous reality swept by Arabs. And here we are 65 years later, and we have one of the more stable economies, one of the finest military powers, next to the U.S., second to the U.S. in terms of high-tech, medical tech, energy alternative technologies, etc. And just to give you an idea, I met recently a group of Americans, and I briefed them on the benefits to the U.S. national security from the U.S. association with Israel. And one of the members of the group shared with us that in 1967 already, the U.S. benefited from Israeli battle tactics because Israel developed the secret how to deal with Soviet surface-to-air missiles, which caused huge number of fatalities to American pilots in Southeast Asia, in Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. Israel developed the flare system. The pilot releases flares. The flares attract the missiles away from the plane, thus sparing the lives of the pilots. And the person told me, he's a retired Pentagon person, that battle tactic alone caused the U.S. to spare scores, if not hundreds, of losses. Since those days, we have come a long, long way, and suffice to say that former chief of the Air Force Intelligence, Brigadier General George Keegan, used to refer to Israel as a country of 5 CIAs, stating that when it comes to intelligence, Israel provides the U.S. with intelligence which is 5 times as much as the CIA does.
Well, I think that's a great way to wrap up our program. Yoram, again, I want to thank you for joining us via Skype from Jerusalem. As always, an interesting conversation. We look forward to having you join us again on International Forum. Thanks very much, and we will talk again soon.
Thank you.
This is Roy Cohen, producer and director of the International Forum show. Thank you for watching, and we welcome your comments to our email address, international.forum@yahoo.com.